All right, so now I want to take you through the story Cathedral. I want to give you an introduction to it. We'll go through it a little bit later on. But Cathedral was written by Raymond Carver, and it's one of the stories you're reading in this unit. Raymond Carver was born in 1938 and died in 1988, so at 50. He was born in Clatskanie, Oregon, to a working class family. By working class, that means that they didn't have a ton of money. In fact, they were pretty much on the edge of poverty. Um, they worked blue collar jobs and they were basically doing their best to get by. At 19, he was married and had two kids by the age of 21. Um, but in 1961, he published his first short story. And then in 1963, he graduated from Humboldt State College. He did suffer from alcoholism, which he gave up. 10 years before his death, he moved away from alcohol. He's basically determined he wanted to live a longer life, and because of that, he knew that alcohol was going to kill him. Much of his work focuses on the effects of alcohol on people. But ultimately, at the age of 50, he died of lung cancer. So even though he gave up the alcohol to live longer, and he probably did because he gave up the alcohol, he still died of lung cancer. He was heralded as, quote, surely the most influential writer of American short stories in the second half of the 20th century by the New York Times. So, what was happening when Carver began writing or began being published and recognized for his work was that the American short story was basically a dying form. He was credited with reviving what was once thought of as a dying literary form. This is an important note because the idea of the short story, people had they'd fallen out of fashion. People weren't really reading short stories. And then Carver comes along and he's saying something new. He's kind of bringing this story, this form back, and people are really enjoying his work. It's a big deal that the New York Times is saying that he did this. He was compared to literary greats like Ernest Hemingway, which you at this point probably have read Hills Like White Elephants. You should have. Stephen Crane and Anton Chekhov. To be compared to Chekhov is huge. When someone's wanting to learn to write short stories, Anton Chekhov his work is kind of like the Bible of short story writing. When you read his work, it is considered to be like the end all and be all. He is the best short story writer ever. And to have Carver being compared to him is really pretty flattering, I would say. His writing style is described as minimalist, so it's sparse. The plots are really low key. The characters are portrayed as living on the edge of poverty, alcoholic self-destruction, and loneliness. And we really are going to see this in Cathedral with our narrator, who we don't know his economic level, but we understand that he's working not because he loves his job, but because he needs a paycheck. We see him consuming a ton of alcohol. We see him being pretty self-destructive, and he's certainly lonely. In fact, he's dying for some sort of connection to someone, but he doesn't even know it. Again, in this story, we see minimalism. This story is going to rely pretty heavily on dialogue. We're going to see a lot of conversation between Robert, the guest, or the blind. His name is Robert. He's often referred to as the blind man. And our narrator. And that dialogue is going to mimic how people actually speak, but use some repetition to create rhythm and emphasis. This is considered a slice of life piece of literature. It's revealing an everyday glimpse of everyday life. There's no real action, no real setting, just kind of a conversation. But there's a clear beginning, middle, and end. Now, this story is different than some slice of life literature in that Cathedral does offer us some opportunity to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, a real story, because we have a new character that is showing up. There's another story by Raymond Carver called What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, which is two couples that are literally just sitting at a table talking for the entire time. With Cathedral, we do have a new character being brought in. We see them have a meal. We see this conversation in front of the TV. So it's still very much slice of life, and that there's nothing really exciting going on other than that there's this new person in our narrator's house and he's having to interact with him. But really, at its essence, it's kind of just an experience and conversation. Uh, Carver's work is often considered dirty realism. So it's realist literature, so it's real everyday people, but they're middle class characters facing disappointment, heartbreak, and harsh truths during their everyday lives. So there's nothing that's dressed up or pretty about this literature. It's just your standard blue collar type family, and these are all the heartbreaks that come with their lives. We see in Cathedral several things. First, we see the idea of art as insight. So we're going to see how drawing or poetry, some of these things might show us how people are more insightful, those who are inclined to be able to art, or how one gains insight through art. We're going to see the idea of drinking really being brought up and looked at. And then we're going to see this idea of seeing versus looking. What does it mean to see versus to simply look at something? Um, the cathedral in the story is going to be a major symbol, as are the audio tapes. And we're going to see in this story something called a zero ending. It's an ending that doesn't neatly tie up, it just kind of stops. And we're left at the end with an ending that is an epiphany, but it doesn't wrap it up in a bow for us. An epiphany is when a main character kind of has this moment that they're trying, where something happens and they understand something new, but they don't really understand what it is. This story is told in the first person retrospective, very much like Snow. So we have a character who is looking back on something that happened. And the fact that this character is looking back on this encounter with Robert coming to visit him helps us understand that he's trying to understand this epiphany, this moment he has at the end regarding the cathedral with Robert. And we understand that he's really trying to come to terms. He's trying to learn something. Um, as you're reading the story, if you have questions, please let me know.